I thought I buried that part of my life forever, until I saw her again. The city glittered beneath the glass walls of the rooftop gala, a sea of gold lights stretching across Manhattan like it belonged to people who never had to look back. And Ethan Carter stood right in the center of it all, tailored suit, quiet confidence. A man who built an empire out of precision and control. The kind of man who never let emotions interfere with business, never let the past interfere with progress, until tonight. Until the moment his eyes drifted past the champagne flutes and polished smiles, past the reflection of himself in the window, and landed on something that didn't belong in his world anymore. A figure across the street, blurred by the rain, standing under a flickering streetlight like a memory that refused to fade. And for a second he thought he was imagining it, because it couldn't be her. Not here, not like this. But then she shifted slightly, one hand instinctively resting on her stomach, and the world around him went completely silent. Lily Brooks, soaked from head to toe, her coat thin, her hair clinging to her face, her posture unsteady like she'd been standing there too long, like she had nowhere else to go, and Ethan's grip tightened around his glass without him realizing it, his heartbeat slowing and racing at the same time. Because the last time he saw her, she was walking away from him without looking back, leaving behind nothing but questions he never wanted answered. And now she was here, right outside his perfect life, carrying something he didn't yet understand, something that made his chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain. A sharp laugh echoed behind him, someone calling his name, but it sounded distant, irrelevant, because all he could see was her, the way she swayed slightly, the way her hand pressed more firmly against her stomach. And then it hit him, not as a thought, but as a feeling, something heavy, something undeniable. And before he could stop himself, before logic could catch up with instinct, he set the glass down untouched and moved, weaving through the crowd, ignoring the voices, the expectations, the world he was supposed to stay inside, because something about the way she stood there didn't feel right, didn't feel safe. And as the elevator doors closed behind him, the reflection staring back wasn't the composed billionaire everyone knew. It was a man staring down a past he never truly escaped. The rain hit harder the moment he stepped outside, cold, sharp, real, and the city no longer looked like a kingdom. It looked like distance, like consequences, like everything he chose not to face. And with every step toward her, the memories came back uninvited. Her laugh, her silence the night she left, the unanswered message still sitting somewhere in his phone, unopened, because he had convinced himself it didn't matter, that she didn't matter. But now she was right in front of him, closer with every step. And when she finally looked up, their eyes met. And in that single second, everything he thought he had under control began to slip away. The rain softened into a steady rhythm, tapping against the pavement as Ethan stopped just a few feet away from her, close enough to see the way her shoulders trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion, the kind that settles deep and lingers. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the distance between them filled with everything that had been left unsaid, everything that had been easier to ignore when she was not standing right in front of him. Real, fragile, and undeniably changed. Lily's eyes flickered over his face as if she was trying to confirm he was actually there, her lips parting slightly before she let out a quiet breath that carried more weight than any accusation ever could. Ethan, she said softly, his name sounding unfamiliar in her voice after all this time. And he realized he had not heard it spoken like that in years, not without tension, not without distance, just simple, honest recognition. And it hit harder than he expected. "You should not be out here," he replied automatically, his voice steady, controlled, the version of himself he had perfected over the years slipping back into place even as something inside him resisted it. "It is 40 degrees and raining," he added, as if logic could explain what he was seeing, as if facts could make sense of the way her hand remained protectively over her stomach. Lily gave a faint, almost amused smile that did not reach her eyes. "I did not really have a choice," she said, glancing briefly over her shoulder, not in fear, but in habit, like someone used to checking if there was somewhere else to go and already knowing the answer. "Nowhere." Ethan followed her gaze instinctively, but saw nothing unusual, just passing cars and blurred headlights cutting through the rain. Yet something about the way she moved, the way she shifted her weight as if every second standing there cost her more than it should, made his chest tighten again. "Are you alone?" he asked, the question coming out sharper than intended. And for a second she hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly against her coat. "I have been for a while," she answered, and there was no bitterness in her tone, just a quiet acceptance that unsettled him more than anger ever could. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, rain soaking into the edges of his perfectly styled appearance, the contrast almost absurd, because nothing about this moment fit into the controlled world he had built. "You should be somewhere warm," he said, softer this time. And she let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "I was trying to get there," she replied, and only then did he notice the faint crease of discomfort on her face, the way she shifted again, slower this time, as if even that small movement required effort, and something inside him shifted with it, something instinctive, something that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the present, with the fact that she was standing here in front of him, vulnerable in a way he had never seen before. "Come on," he said, the words coming before he could overthink them. Already reaching for the passenger door of his car parked just a few yards away, Lily did not move right away, her eyes searching his face as if she was trying to understand what had changed, what this meant. And for a brief second he saw the hesitation, the memory of who he had been the last time they spoke, the man who had let her walk away without stopping her. But then another wave of rain swept through, colder this time, and she closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself before finally taking a step forward, slow, careful, and when she reached the car, her hand brushed lightly against the frame as if grounding herself. Ethan opened the door wider without saying anything, watching as she eased herself into the seat, her movements deliberate, protective, and only when she settled did he notice it fully, the undeniable curve beneath her coat, the truth he had not yet allowed himself to process settling heavily in the space between them. And as he closed the door gently, the sound felt louder than it should have, like something final, something that marked the moment his life had just taken a turn he could no longer ignore. The engine started with a low, controlled hum, the warmth of the car slowly pushing back against the cold that had settled into Lily's skin, but the silence between them remained, thick, unfamiliar, stretching longer than either of them expected, and Ethan kept his eyes on the road as he pulled away from the curb, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and white against the rain-streaked windshield, his grip steady on the wheel even as his mind tried to catch up with everything that had just happened, with everything that was sitting just a few feet away from him, real and impossible at the same time. Lily leaned back slightly in the seat, her breathing shallow at first before gradually evening out, one hand still resting over her stomach as if it was instinct, as if it had become second nature to protect something he still had not fully allowed himself to acknowledge. "You do not have to do this," she said quietly after a few moments, her voice softer now, almost careful, as if she did not want to disturb the fragile balance that had formed between them. Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the road. "I am not doing anything," he replied, but even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow, incomplete, because this was something, this was everything, and they both knew it. Lily turned her head slightly toward the window, watching the rain slide down the glass in uneven lines. "You always say that," she murmured, not accusing, just stating something that had once been familiar, something that still lingered between them despite everything that had happened. And that small sentence hit harder than anything else she could have said, because it reminded him of the version of himself he had convinced himself was justified, the one who chose silence over questions, distance over understanding, the one who let her walk away without fighting for the truth. Ethan tightened his jaw slightly, the memory flickering through his mind before he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the present, on the way she shifted again in her seat, slower this time, her hand pressing a little more firmly against her stomach. "Are you okay?" he asked, the question coming out before he could stop it, his tone different now, less controlled, more human. Lily hesitated for a second before nodding faintly. "Just tired," she answered, but the way her fingers curled slightly into the fabric of her coat told a different story, one that made his chest tighten again. "When was the last time you saw a doctor?" he asked, glancing at her briefly before returning his focus to the road. She did not answer right away, and that silence was answer enough. Ethan let out a slow breath, his mind already shifting into action, into solutions. Because that was what he knew how to do. Fix things, control outcomes, create certainty. Where there was none. But this was not a business deal. This was not something he could calculate. And yet he could not ignore it. Not anymore. Not after seeing her like this. "We are going to a hospital," he said firmly, not leaving room for argument. And she turned to look at him fully for the first time since getting into the car, something unreadable in her eyes, something that was not quite resistance and not quite acceptance. "Ethan," she started, but he shook his head slightly, cutting her off without raising his voice. "You are not fine," he said, the certainty in his tone surprising even himself, because it was not based on data or facts. It was instinct, raw and undeniable. The car slowed as they approached an intersection, the red light casting a faint glow across the interior, illuminating her face in a way that made everything clearer, the exhaustion, the quiet strength, the weight she had been carrying alone. And for a moment neither of them spoke again, the world outside continuing as if nothing had changed, as if this moment was not quietly rewriting everything. And when the light turned green, Ethan pressed the gas gently, the decision already made, even if neither of them had said it out loud, because some things did not need words, some things were already set in motion. The second he saw her standing in the rain, the hospital entrance came into view under a wash of white fluorescent lights, the sharp brightness cutting through the rain and reflecting off the wet pavement as Ethan pulled the car up to the curb, the engine barely settling before he was already out of his seat, moving quickly around to the passenger side without hesitation, the cold air hitting him again but no longer registering the same way, because his focus had narrowed entirely to her, to the way Lily remained still for a moment. Inside the car, as if gathering what little strength she had left, her hand still resting protectively over her stomach. And when he opened the door, she looked up at him with something softer now, something quieter, not quite trust, but not resistance either, just a fragile kind of acceptance. "I can walk," she said gently, already shifting forward, and Ethan nodded once, not arguing, but staying close enough that if she faltered even slightly, he would catch it before it happened. The automatic doors slid open with a soft mechanical sound, warm air spilling out to meet them as they stepped inside, the sterile scent of the hospital wrapping around them instantly, a sharp contrast to the rain and chaos outside. And for a brief second, everything slowed, the bright lights, the quiet murmur of voices, the distant beeping of machines somewhere deeper in the building, all of it grounding in a way that felt almost unreal. Lily's steps were careful but steady, though slower than they should have been, and Ethan stayed just half a step behind her, his presence constant, silent, unspoken, until they reached the reception desk. "We need a doctor," he said, his voice calm but firm, the kind of tone that did not invite delay. The nurse looked up, her expression shifting immediately as she took in Lily's condition, her gaze softening with quiet urgency. "How far along are you?" she asked, already stepping out from behind the desk, and Lily hesitated for just a second before answering. "Almost 7 months," her voice low but steady, the words hanging in the air longer than they should have, because the moment they were spoken, something inside Ethan shifted again, deeper this time, heavier, more real, the number settling into his mind like a piece of a puzzle he had not yet put together. The nurse nodded quickly, guiding Lily toward a wheelchair despite her quiet protest. "Just to be safe," she reassured her, and Ethan watched as Lily finally allowed herself to sit, her shoulders lowering slightly, as if she had been holding everything up on her own for far too long. They moved down the hallway, the sound of wheels against the polished floor echoing softly, and Ethan followed closely, his hands at his sides, resisting the instinct to reach out, because he did not know if he had the right to anymore. A doctor met them halfway, asking quick, practiced questions, checking vitals, listening carefully, and Ethan stood there, still, silent, absorbing every word without fully processing them, until one phrase cut through everything else. "She is dehydrated and under a lot of stress, but we brought her in at the right time," the doctor said, glancing briefly at Ethan before returning focus to Lily, and that was when it hit him, not as a dramatic realization but as a quiet, undeniable truth. If he had not seen her tonight, if he had stayed upstairs, if he had chosen to look away the way he had before, She would have been out there alone, in the cold, carrying something far more important than either of them had said out loud. And as Lily was guided into a room, the door closing softly behind her, Ethan remained in the hallway. The noise of the hospital continuing around him, but distant, muted, because for the first time in a long time, control was no longer something he could rely on, and the only thing that mattered was on the other side of that door. Time moved differently in the hallway, slower, heavier, each second stretching longer than it should as Ethan stood just outside the closed door, his eyes fixed on the small rectangular window that offered only a partial glimpse inside. A blur of movement, soft voices, controlled urgency, and he realized how unfamiliar this kind of waiting felt to him. Because in his world, things moved on his timeline. Decisions were immediate, outcomes predictable. But this was different. This was something he could not accelerate or negotiate. Something that forced him to stand still and face the weight of what he had almost missed. A nurse passed by with a clipboard, offering him a brief, polite nod, but he barely registered it. His mind already drifting back, replaying moments he had locked away. The last conversation with Lily, the way she had stood in front of him trying to explain something he had not wanted to hear. The message she sent afterward that he never opened. The silence he chose because it felt easier than the truth. And now that silence echoed louder than anything else. The door opened suddenly, pulling him back to the present as the doctor stepped out, removing a pair of gloves and offering a small, reassuring smile. "She is stable," the doctor said, the words landing with a quiet but undeniable relief. "We are running some additional tests, but right now she and the baby are okay." The sentence lingered in the air for a moment, and Ethan felt it settle in his chest. Not fully understood, but deeply felt. The baby. The word repeating in his mind in a way that made everything shift slightly. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice lower now, less certain than before. The doctor studied him for a brief second before nodding. "Just for a few minutes. She needs rest." Ethan nodded once in return, pushing the door open gently, as if even the sound could disrupt something fragile. The room inside was quiet, softly lit, the steady rhythm of a monitor providing a calm, consistent backdrop. Lily lay in the bed, her eyes closed, her face finally relaxed in a way it had not been before. The tension gone, replaced by something closer to peace, and for a moment, he just stood there, taking it in, the reality of her presence, the undeniable proof of everything he had been avoiding. He stepped closer slowly, careful, almost hesitant, as if unsure of his place, and then he noticed it, resting on the small table beside her, a thin folder slightly open, the edge of a document visible. He did not mean to look, but his eyes caught it anyway, drawn by something instinctive. Something he could not explain, and before he could stop himself, he reached out, lifting the paper just enough to see the heading clearly printed at the top. Prenatal test results. His breath caught slightly, his gaze moving down the page until it landed on a line that made everything else fall away. Paternity probability, 99.9%. Ethan Carter. The room seemed to shift around him, the quiet suddenly louder, the steady beep of the monitor sharper, more defined. And for a second he could not move, could not think, because the truth was no longer something abstract or implied. It was right there in front of him, undeniable, irreversible, and slowly, almost unconsciously, his eyes lifted from the paper to Lily, to the woman who had carried this alone, who had stood in the rain without asking for anything, who had not come to him, had not forced the truth into his world. And that realization hit harder than anything else, because it meant she had chosen to protect herself, to survive without him. And as he carefully placed the paper back exactly where it had been, his hand lingered there for just a second longer than necessary, the weight of everything settling into something new, something he could not ignore anymore. And when he finally looked at her again, there was no distance left, no version of the past he could hide behind, only the undeniable reality that everything had changed, and this time, it was not something he could walk away from. Lily stirred slightly before opening her eyes, the soft shift barely audible against the quiet rhythm of the room. But Ethan noticed instantly, straightening just a little as if caught in a moment he had not yet decided how to handle, her gaze unfocused at first before settling on him. And for a brief second there was confusion, then recognition, followed by something more guarded, something that placed distance back between them even in the small space they now shared. "You are still here," she said softly, her voice rough from exhaustion but steady enough to carry meaning, and Ethan nodded once, his expression controlled but no longer detached. "The doctor said you needed rest," he replied, choosing the safest answer, the one that did not reveal everything that had shifted inside him just moments before. Lily glanced away slightly, her hand instinctively moving back to her stomach, that same quiet, protective gesture he now understood with a clarity that left no room for denial. And the silence stretched again, heavier this time, filled with truths neither of them had yet spoken aloud. "You should not have come," she said after a moment, her tone not harsh but firm in a way that suggested she had already thought this through long before tonight. Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting briefly to the side before returning to her. "I did not know," he said, and for the first time, there was something in his voice that sounded less certain, less controlled, as if the words themselves were not enough to carry what he meant. Lily let out a small breath, almost a tired smile, but without warmth. "You did not ask," she replied quietly, and that landed exactly where it needed to, direct, simple, impossible to argue, because she was right. He had not asked. He had chosen distance over understanding, silence over truth, and now he was standing in a room that existed because of that choice. Ethan took a step closer, slower this time, more deliberate, as if aware that every movement mattered. "I should have," he said, the admission simple but heavier than anything else he had said so far. And Lily studied him for a moment, searching his face not for answers but for sincerity, something real, something that had not been there the last time they spoke. "It would not have changed anything back then," she said finally, her voice calm but distant, and he knew she meant it, not as blame, but as fact, because the version of him she knew then would not have listened even if she had tried harder. The room fell quiet again, the steady monitor continuing its quiet rhythm. And Ethan glanced briefly at the folder on the table before looking back at her, his decision forming not from logic but from something far more grounded. "How long were you going to do this alone?" he asked, not accusing, not demanding, just asking something he should have asked a long time ago. Lily hesitated, her eyes dropping for a second before returning to him. "As long as I had to," she answered, and there was no hesitation in that, no doubt. Just a quiet strength that made his chest tighten again, because she had already prepared herself for a future without him, had already built a version of her life where he did not exist, and that realization settled into him deeper than anything else. "You are not alone anymore," he said, the words coming out steady, firm, leaving no space for misinterpretation, and this time, Lily did not respond right away, her eyes holding his for a moment longer, searching, measuring, as if deciding whether those words meant anything now, whether they came too late. And as the silence lingered between them, something shifted again, not resolved, not forgiven, but no longer the same as before, because this time, he was not looking away. The silence between them did not break all at once, it shifted slowly, like something fragile being tested instead of forced, and Lily finally looked away first, her gaze settling somewhere near the edge of the bed, as if it was easier to focus on something small and still than on the weight of everything standing in front of her. "You do not get to decide that," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm, not raised, not emotional, just certain in a way that made it clear she had already drawn that line long before tonight. Ethan did not respond immediately, because he understood what she meant, understood that this was not about a single moment or a single promise. This was about everything that came before it. Everything he had not done when it mattered most. And for once, he did not try to correct it, did not try to control the direction of the conversation. He simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement that felt more honest than anything else he could have said. "You are right," he admitted, the words simple but carrying a weight that lingered in the air. Lily glanced back at him, just briefly, as if she had not expected that answer, and something in her expression softened for a fraction of a second before settling again into something more guarded. "I am not asking you for anything," she added, her hand resting lightly over her stomach again, a gesture that now carried more meaning than any explanation. "I have managed this far." And there it was, the quiet truth of her reality, Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just steady, resilient, built day by day without him. Ethan took that in, not as rejection, but as something he needed to understand before he said anything else. "I know," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, more grounded. "And I am not here because you asked," he continued, taking a small step closer, stopping just short of crossing a line he knew was not his to cross yet. "I am here because I should have been here a long time ago." And that was different, not a promise, not a demand, just a statement that placed the responsibility exactly where it belonged. Lily studied him again, longer this time, searching for something deeper than words, something that would tell her whether this version of him was real or just another moment that would pass once things became inconvenient. "People do not change that quickly," she said quietly, not as a challenge, but as a fact she had learned the hard way. Ethan did not argue with that either, because she was right. Change did not happen in a single night. It did not erase the past. It did not undo the damage already done. "Maybe they do not," he replied, his tone steady. "But they can choose what they do next." And for the first time since he had walked into that room, there was no hesitation in his voice, no distance, just clarity. The kind that came not from certainty, but from decision. The room fell quiet again, but this time it felt different. Less like avoidance and more like space. Space for something new to exist without forcing it into shape too quickly. Lily exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as if she was allowing herself, for the first time, to consider something she had not planned for, something she had not prepared herself to rely on. "You always liked having a plan," she said softly, a faint trace of the past slipping into her voice, and Ethan let out a small breath, almost a quiet acknowledgement of that truth. "Not this time," he answered, and that, more than anything else, made her pause, because for once, he was not trying to control the outcome. He was simply choosing to stay, and as the silence settled around them again, it no longer felt like something they needed to escape. It felt like something they were slowly learning how to share. Morning light filtered softly through the hospital blinds, turning the sterile white room into something quieter, almost calm, as if the night had carried away some of the tension and left behind a fragile kind of clarity. Lily sat propped up against the pillows now, a glass of water in her hand, her movements slower but steadier than before, and Ethan stood by the window, his jacket draped over a chair, his phone in his hand but untouched, the screen dimming after another ignored notification, because for once, the world outside that room felt distant, unimportant, like something he could step away from without consequence. "You have not left since last night," Lily said after a while, her voice gentle but observant, and he glanced over at her, not defensive, not dismissive, just present. "I told you I would stay," he replied simply, and she studied him again, that same careful look, as if she was still deciding what to do with that, what it meant, whether it would last beyond the walls of this place. A nurse stepped in briefly, checking her vitals, offering a reassuring smile before leaving again, the quiet returning just as quickly as it had been interrupted, and Lily let out a slow breath, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the blanket. "You do not have to change your life because of this," she said, her words measured, deliberate, not pushing him away but not inviting him in either, just setting a boundary that made sense in the life she had built on her own. Ethan turned fully toward her then, his expression thoughtful, not reacting immediately, because he understood what she was really saying, not just about him, but about control, about expectations, about the fear of depending on something that might disappear again. "I am not changing my life because of this," he said after a moment, his tone steady, grounded. "I am adjusting it. Because I should have done that a long time ago." And there was a difference there, subtle but important, one that did not place the weight on her or the baby, but on his own choices, his own responsibility. Lily looked at him for a long second, her eyes searching, and for the first time, there was less resistance in her expression, not trust yet, not fully, but something closer to openness, something that had not been there before. "What does that even mean?" she asked quietly, and Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing briefly at the city outside before looking back at her. "It means I am not going back to pretending this does not matter," he said, his voice calm but certain. "Not you, not the baby, not what I did." And the honesty in that landed differently than anything else he had said. so far, because it did not try to fix everything at once. It did not promise more than he could prove. It simply acknowledged what was real. Lily's hand moved again, resting over her stomach, her thumb tracing a small, absent pattern as she absorbed his words. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching between them in a way that no longer felt heavy, but thoughtful, as if both of them were standing at the edge of something new, something uncertain but no longer impossible. And when she finally looked up at him again, there was a softness there that had not been present before, not forgiveness, not yet, but something that suggested she was no longer completely closed off to the possibility of what came next. "You cannot just show up once and expect everything to be different," she said, her voice still steady but no longer distant, and Ethan nodded slightly, already understanding. "I know," he replied, taking a small step closer, not enough to overwhelm, just enough to be seen. "That is why I am not leaving." And this time, when the words settled into the space between them, they did not feel like a promise made out of guilt or impulse. They felt like a decision, quiet but firm, the kind that would be tested, the kind that would have to be proven. And as the morning light continued to brighten the room, something shifted again, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to change the direction of what would come next. 3 weeks later, the city no longer felt like something distant or divided. It felt shared in a way neither of them had expected. The morning light stretching across the living room of Ethan's penthouse where the sharp edges of glass and steel had softened with small, quiet changes, a folded blanket on the couch that did not belong to him, a pair of worn sneakers near the door, a glass of water always within reach on the table. And Lily stood by the window now, one hand resting naturally over her stomach, no longer guarded in the same way, just present, steady, and Ethan watched from across the room as he adjusted the thermostat down a few degrees, not because the temperature required it, but because he had learned she preferred it slightly cooler in the mornings. A small detail he would not have noticed before, but now felt important. "You do not have to keep doing that," Lily said softly, glancing over her shoulder with a faint smile that carried something lighter than before, something closer to ease, and he shrugged slightly, not dismissive, just honest. "I am getting used to paying attention," he replied, and she held his gaze for a second longer than usual. Something unspoken passing between them, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just real, built from days that had not been perfect but had been consistent, steady. And when she turned back to the window, her reflection caught his eye, the quiet strength that had always been there now no longer hidden behind exhaustion, no longer alone. "The doctor said everything looks good," she added, her voice calm, but with a softness that hinted at relief, and Ethan nodded, stepping closer, but not crowding her. The space between them no longer a barrier but a choice. "I know," he said, his tone carrying something grounded, something certain, because this time, he had been there for every appointment, every check, every moment that mattered, not as a gesture, not as a correction, but as a decision he had followed through on day after day. Lily exhaled slowly, her hand moving slightly, as if acknowledging the life growing within her, and then she turned to face him fully, her expression thoughtful, searching but no longer defensive. "You really stayed," she said quietly, and there was no accusation in it now, no disbelief, just a quiet recognition of something that had taken time to prove itself. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "I said I would," he replied, simple, steady, and she nodded faintly, as if accepting that not as a promise, but as something that had already been shown, already been built. The silence that followed was not heavy, not uncertain, it was comfortable, the kind that came from understanding rather than avoidance. And after a moment, she took a small step toward him, not closing the distance completely, just enough to shift what had once been impossible into something that felt natural. "We are not the same people we were," she said softly, and he gave a slight nod, because that was true, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that erased the past, but in a way that allowed something new to exist alongside it. "No," he agreed, his voice quiet but certain, "but we can decide who we are now." And this time, when the words settled between them, they did not need to be questioned, they did not need to be tested immediately, because they had already begun to take shape in everything that had happened since that night. Lily's hand shifted slightly, And for the first time, she reached out, not fully, just enough for her fingers to brush lightly against his. A small gesture, almost hesitant, but real, and Ethan did not move away, did not rush it. He simply stayed there, letting the moment exist exactly as it was, unforced, genuine. And as the sunlight continued to fill the room, the city outside moving forward as it always did, something inside that space settled into place, not as a perfect ending, but as a beginning that no longer needed to be imagined, because it was already happening. One quiet choice at a time.